All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out to Dreamforce. We're very excited to have you here. My name is Taggart Mathieson, and I'm the product manager for Apex Code. And today I'm going to walk through for about 50 minutes, a little State of the Union, talk about some of the features that we've just released, and then also talk about our roadmap. As you all know, you've seen this safe harbor statement. Don't ask me about it. We're a publicly traded company, and as such, we have a safe harbor statement. If you have any questions about this, please go to www.salesforce.com/investor. Okay, I can't see the agenda from here. All right, so what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a little bit about State of the Union, where we've come in the last 2 years. And then we'll get into the meat here. We'll talk about Batch Apex and custom settings, two huge features, in my opinion, that we released with the Winter 10. And then I'll talk about the Apex Scheduler, not to be confused with the Cloud Scheduler. And this is in pilot. And if anyone is interested after I talk about the scheduler, I'm going to try to be outside, although I don't know if anyone saw how many people there were out there. So I'll probably be by the Dev Lounge for the most of today, as well as Thursday and Friday. So any questions that we don't get answered after I do the roadmap during the Q&A, please come find me, tap me on the shoulder. I'll be wearing a black sweater and black pants again. And that's about it. So let's kick this off. And I'm going the wrong way. Oh, no, that's me. All right. Welcome to Apex. So the last 2 years have been pretty remarkable for my team. When I joined, we had less than 1 million lines of code that developers, you people in the audience, that had placed onto our service and trusted with our service. And in less than 2 years, we now have over 188 million lines of code. So to me, that's just spectacular. But even more compelling is the fact that we started with less than 100 customers that had deployed their own code. So we're talking non-namespace code. We're not talking managed packages. We're talking about customers that have taken their code from their development or sandbox environments and promoted it to their production instances. And that was less than 100 about 2 years ago. We now have passed 10,000 customers using Apex in production. So again, thank you all for doing this. The team's very excited, and to be honest with you, we just see this continue to grow. But we're not just watching that. In the last 2 years, Apex has evolved as well. And we evolved from a product standpoint and also from a language standpoint. So quickly going through some of these, we introduced Dynamic Apex, so Dynamic SOCL, Dynamic DML. We introduced Apex Describe, so being able to dynamically describe the metadata in your organization. DML Options, so exposing assignment headers to Apex operations. Async Apex, which to me is a huge one, because what we basically did was allow you to invoke Apex, but then execute that on our asynchronous framework. So introducing async nature, async execution to our platform. On top of that, with this release, we've just released Batch Apex, and I'll walk through it. I've got a relatively straightforward demo to kind of explain what that is. And last but not least, custom settings. Now, how many in the audience know what custom settings is? Raise your hand. Wow, okay, well, then I won't even talk about it. No, I'm going to go through a demo anyways. Hopefully when I'm done, everyone will know, everyone will run out of this room in an orderly fashion and go ahead and build some custom settings on their own orgs. Okay, but we're not just stopping on the features. From a language perspective, we introduced inheritance, Apex properties, which is a nice little syntax that we grabbed from the guys up in Redmond, parameterized interfaces, which is our entry to generic support, and most importantly, if we go back to that last slide, performance and scalability. That will always be our number one. No matter how long I'm focused or whatever feature I'm focused on, performance and scalability will always be number one. Okay, so let's talk about Batch Apex. I like to describe it in the standpoint of what are the use cases we couldn't support before Batch Apex. And one of the easiest ones is the owner reassignment. So let's say the use case is I've got a couple million opportunities, which would be nice, but if I had a couple million opportunities and I wanted to go ahead and reassign those from one set of owners to another set of owners, sure, you could do the logic in Apex, but we ran into the situation that you were just dealing with too many records in a synchronous fashion. So the only way that you could do that on our platform was to do it outside of our platform. Customers had to build client apps that basically used our SOAP API to pull all that information down, do all the processing on the client, and then propagate that back using the API. But now with Batch Apex, we allow you to generate a very large scope, actually up to 50 million records, and then allow you to operate on top of those natively on our platform and do that asynchronously. So I'm not just talking about owner reassignment or search and replace. I'm talking about data validation, data cleansing, data enrichment. And if you start thinking about it, you realize that I can run a very long-running, complex process on the platform that does some sort of geocoding to accounts or address validation. And I'm not concerned if I'm dealing with 1 million records, 5 million, or 10 million records. And the last but not least, from a use case standpoint, is complex reporting. Now, from a declarative standpoint, we have amazing report capability. But there's certain cases where our declarative tools don't provide you enough flexibility. And that's where you can leverage something like Batch Apex to literally iterate through a data set, build a set of summary-level objects, and then use our reporting on top of that to basically show those reports to your end users. And how are we doing this? We're doing this by leveraging our asynchronous platform. And so that's kind of our queuing infrastructure. We allow you to invoke that batch request synchronously, but all the processing is done asynchronously. The way that we deal with these large operations is that behind the scenes, we take that query locator, we take that scope, and we chunk it up into small executions. Last but not least, although we allow you to operate on a very large set of data, the start method, the execute method, and the finish method still operate within the limits in our system. So it's not a way to get around the limits, but from a query standpoint, we allow you to capture or operate against a very large set of data. So here's my little graph. What I thought I'd do is quickly show you how this all works from a visual perspective, and then we'll go into a demo. Using that last use case, the owner reassignment, the way that you'd probably do it is you have a Visualforce page with a form. You've got a controller backing it. You basically allow the user to select some set of attributes that you can then apply in the controller when they submit. And in the controller, you would have an instance of a class that implements Batchable, and you'd call database.executeBatch, which then synchronously hands back an ID to that job, but the actual execution is passed to our asynchronous framework. So it gets passed to the asynchronous framework. It's no longer tied to the user session. And at that point, we then call start. And start returns an iterable or a query locator, which we then use to call all of the executes. Now, we don't just call one execute. What we basically do is analogous to what we do with the API. Instead of operating through the entire set in one go, we chunk it up. So by default, we'll take 200 records, we'll call execute. 200 records, call execute. 200 records, call execute. You get the point. We iterate through until we've gone through all of the records, and then we have the last method, which is finish. And finish is really your notification method that allows you to perform whatever email you want to at the end, or audit record as part of that batch, process. So let's take a quick look. All right. So actually, let's talk about the use case first. Very simple, search and replace. We've got about 40,000 accounts. They're tied to one industry. I'm going to use Batch to go ahead and change them from industry A to industry B. So how do I do that? Well, I have a very simple admin tool page built using Visualforce. Okay. We have a couple of tools here. Owner reassignment, search and replace, visualize accounts. We're going to go ahead and do search and replace. So using the describe API, I'm going to go ahead and grab the metadata. I've got, here's account. Based on that, I'll re-render page block section here, grab the field industry, and we'll just change this. Well, let's first look at the report. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Okay, just to prove it to you. we've got 40,000 accounts, and they're all in the high-tech industry. So we'll change it to banking. So let's go ahead and do that. So search and replace, account, industry, banking. I'm going to call replace. This is going to invoke the method as well as pass us to another page. Now the batch process is enqueued on our service. When our service recognizes it, it's going to pick it up and it's going to start processing it. And the way that I'm managing this page right now is I've got a query, not a query, but an action puller. So every 5 seconds what I'm basically doing is going back and checking the status of that job and how many items have completed. So if we go into the reports as this is running, and again, it's asynchronous, so it's not tied to the session. I could log out, I could log back in. Someone else could look at that screen as well. And we go into the report, and lo and behold, about 8,000 now are banking. And if we refresh that again, okay, so 11,000. So it's just kind of chugging along. And let's go back to that. View active jobs. So it's halfway complete. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the implementation to show you how I did all of this. So first, I'm just going to go directly to search and replace Visualforce page. Someone's cell phone. Okay, page editor. You'll see I just have 2 page block sections. See if you can see this. So the first simply leverages the describe to pull back all the entities in this organization. The second one is dynamically rendered based on the entity that I select. So again, if I go back, we can do asset. We'll now see all the asset fields. So let's take a look at the controller, what's actually driving all of this. Pretty straightforward. First thing that I do is call the schema.getGlobalDescribe. That pulls back all the entities for this organization. I then have 2 selects here. The first is to just get all of the entities, and then based on the selected entity, go ahead and retrieve the fields. And this is how I'm dynamically populating those drop-downs. For the actual batch class itself, here's my dynamic query. So I'm saying select field that the user selected as part of the form, from entity that they selected. Now you can add any filter criteria that you want, but part of the example is that it's just a very basic query which could result in a very large scope. I then pass in this query, the field that they selected and the value that they set from the form. When I instantiate an instance of the search and replace class, I then pass that into database.executeBatch. And synchronously, as I explained in the last slide, the ID is passed synchronously, but the actual execution happens on our asynchronous framework. So at this point, I go ahead and I send us back to that job status page. And then with that job status page, I simply query based on that ID and render a UI component based on the number of items that we completed in that batch. So let's take a look at the classes. Let's make sure this finished as well. So we're going to jump into reports. Okay, so now we're all now banking. 40,000 records have now been changed. It could be 40,000, 400,000, 4 million, 40 million, so forth, all the way up to 50 million from a scope perspective. So go setup. We'll go into develop. And I kind of talk myself through this, so apologies as I navigate to the code. Search and replace. Okay, this is about as straightforward as it gets. Let's go to the top here. I have a couple of member variables that I'm just simply passing that in. So I'm passing in the query, the field, and the value. This class implements database.batchable. Because it implements that, I have to implement 3 methods: start, execute, and finish. As you'll see in start, I'm just passing that dynamic query to the query locator and generating the scope. So if you looked at that visual again, this is really where we identify how large this batch operation is going to be. The execute is where we pass in the chunk of records, which is this list. By default, it's 200. That's actually something that you can configure if you want to, but by default, it's 200. So I know that I'm going to have 200 records coming in here, and I'm simply going to iterate through those S objects, and using the dynamic DML, I'm simply going to take the field that was selected and push in the new value and update that list. That execute's going to spin through there, perform that against all 40,000 records, and then we're going to call finish. Now, you may have noticed there's an argument in here, database.batchable context. Well, what is that? That object allows us to inject the async apex job ID. Why would you want to do that? Well, we want to have some context to the actual job itself. So, for example, in the finish method, I'm using this as a query, and I'm going to return back an instance of the async apex job. And I'm going to grab back the status, number of errors, jobs, items processed, and so forth, and then create an email message and send that message. And I realized I don't have my Outlook set up here, so you'll just have to take my word for it or take a look at my iPhone after the session here. But basically, when the job process completed, it just sent me an email. And that's just the general notification process. Okay, so that's batch apex from an implementation standpoint. But what I also want to do is talk about how would you test something like this. Now, with batch, it's kind of a different beast because it's such a large operation. And we were struggling trying to figure out how we could allow you to test that behavior without having you test 50 million records. And so what we came up with, from a test context, we allow you to test one execute. So what I've done here is I have my setup data method, basically a utility method, that's going to spin through there and create my test data set. I'm going to create 200 records with the sample industry 1, and then I'm going to call my batch apex and change all of those from sample industry 1 to sample industry 2. And as you can see here, I have my test.start test. I perform that. I call my batch. And then I have a little method here, test.stop test. Now, if any of you have used async apex before, you'll know that this is typically the pattern that you would use to assert the behavior of any asynchronous processing. Because tests are synchronous, we can't just hand this off to our asynchronous platform. So what we do is we hang on to the asynchronous request, whether it's async apex or batch, and we actually execute it immediately after the stop test call. And what that allows us to do is then assert the behavior of that request. And so here I'm just asserting that I'm going to get 20 records that were assigned to that, 200 records that were assigned to sample industry 2. Go in here and run the test. It's going to go ahead and run this all synchronously. And I have my coverage. Now, I know this isn't the testing session, and I'll keep this short. But just because I have 100% coverage doesn't mean I actually truly tested my class. I covered 100% of the lines, but let's be honest. I mean, that was just one use case. You always have to think from in my opinion, it's the test-driven development where you have to know all of the use cases, how all your users are going to use your application, and take that to build your tests. And from those tests, develop from those. And so if I was to really do this rather than just a demo, I would think about what are all the permutations that could exist with that form and make sure that I have corresponding tests to validate that. Done with the testing, I promise. Okay, back to the presentation. All right, so best practices with batch apex. Pay close attention to the manner in which you invoke batch. This is important because you can have up to 5 batch processes running at a time. If you put this into trigger context, make sure that you can guarantee the way that that trigger is being invoked. And personally, I would recommend keeping it in a Visualforce page or through a web service or an email service, somewhere where you know that you only have a small set of admins or some other component that can guarantee you that it's not just going to have some bulk request that kicks off or attempts to kick off hundreds or thousands of batch requests. Because basically what's going to happen is if you have 5 running, that 6th or anything above 5 is simply going to fail when you call database.execute batch. Executes are autonomous requests. I'm being a little loose with that language there. But the point is each execute, think of it as its own request. So if I have 1,000 executes, if one fails, the rest is going to continue because they're completely siloed from each other. And the way that we chunk up that request, as I was explaining earlier, we take 200, 200, 200, and so forth. If this one fails, that's not going to impact any of the other executes. But the point with that is you need to make sure that you have the right failure logic. So let's say something did fail in batch item 20. Well, you'd probably want to know about it, or you'd at least want to catch that and send an email or create some sort of auditing record so then you can persist that information and look at it at a later point. The other interface that we introduced is called the stateful interface. And what that allows you to do is share state across all of the executions. So in that earlier example, we were talking about opportunity reassignment. Well, let's say I had, again, 1 million opportunities and I wanted to reassign them, but I wanted to reassign, and at the same time I wanted to see the total amount of opportunities that I reassigned to, let's say, Territory 1 to Territory 2. By using the stateful interface, I can simply have a member variable in that class that I can get and set with each of those executes, and then in the finish I can simply take that aggregate or that summary and send that to a summary object, email it, audit it, whatever it may be. Last but not least, test, test, test. When we start talking about very large operations, it's absolutely critical that you guys have covered all of the possible test cases and permutations. And I'll talk a little bit on the roadmap of how we're going to try to make that easier for you. Okay, I'm going to have a quick custom settings. All right, in my opinion, custom settings is just, it's an amazing feature. And what is it? It's application metadata. These are the tools that you want to use to build apps on our platform. And custom settings, there's two types. There's the list type, and there's the hierarchy type. And the list type, what that basically is it gives you, think of it as like list of values that you use in any operation, whether it's postcodes, zip codes, states, whatever it may be, maybe just some application metadata that you want to surface or evaluate as part of a request. I would highly recommend that you put those into custom settings, and I'll explain why in the next slide. The other one that we have is, I just talked about the list, which is kind of at the app level. The second one is the hierarchy. And the hierarchy one is slightly complicated to explain, but what it basically does is it gives you a personalization aspect with your app. You can set values, effectively singletons, at the org level, the profile level, and the user level. So let's say I had a mapping application and I only wanted one set of my users to be able to see the map. In that app, I could simply say, show map at the org. But in this profile, don't show the map. And in this profile, do show the map. And in my code, I could simply have some method call to custom settings that simply asks, for this running user, what's the value? So I'll kind of walk you through that demo. But unleashing the power, what's the big thing here? Custom settings are cached. I'm going to say it again. Custom settings are cached. Everyone's supposed to clap, but maybe not. But there we go. See? All right. Awesome. Okay. Apologies for that. So you don't get, there's no cost to the database, right? You're not performing a query to the database. You are pulling this out of our cache. So it's efficient. We're not going to penalize you, and we've also provided very simple API to pull that data out. Now, for the list, it's straightforward, right? If I want to get a list, we have, I think it's called getAny, and that's simply going to return a map, and that's going to be the collection of the list-level custom settings that you have associated to an app. But as I was talking about that mapping application, what we've also done is something that I call hierarchy abstraction. And what that means is I can set these values at the org level, the profile level, and the user level, but in my code, all I have to say is, for this running user, what's the custom setting? I don't have to ask, is it set at the user? Okay, if it's not, go to the profile. Oh, okay, it's not, go to the org. I don't have to do that. Behind the scenes, we actually take care of that for you. Last but not least, and this is for all the app devs out there, Obfuscation support. What does that mean? Well, basically, with custom settings, if you set them to protected, you can use these to hide metadata in your org from all of your subscribers. If you look at today, if you release a custom object with your application, well, there's nothing really stopping, unless you really work at it, your end subscribers from querying that information, from modifying that information, from adding workflows. What this basically does is it hides that entire object. Through the setup, they can't see those custom settings. Through the API, they have no access to that data that's stored in there. So what that means is you can store all of the metadata that you need to in your app, and you don't have to be concerned about any customers going in there, modifying it, or manipulating it. Now, how would you expose it to them? Well, what we've done is we still allow access to custom settings if they're in the same namespace. But obviously, if you're a managed package, you're going to have a namespace, and the subscribers are going to have a different namespace. And we simply say, if the code has this namespace, they have access to custom settings. If they don't, you have no access. So if you need to, you can basically create, whether it's Visualforce or web services, an API or a restricted API into those custom settings, but you can use the obfuscation support to pretty much lock it down to guarantee that none of your customers can modify that. So demo. I'm sure you are all enthralled with my admin tools here. I'm gonna go with this theme. If we look at the page editor real quick, you'll see that I have an expression rendered equals unrestricted. You'll see this all over the place. So what is this unrestricted? Let's take a look at the controller. It's Boolean, and I'm setting it here on a constructor. And I have this funny little syntax. Admin tools __ c dot get instance dot unrestricted __ c. Now, the key here is that admin tools is a custom setting. We have a method called get instance. That's going to return the instance of that custom setting associated with the running user. And then I'm simply going to pull the value from that Boolean, that unrestricted field, and pass that to my local unrestricted value. So if we're going to go, one second here, I'm missing a new tab. Okay, so let's take a look at that custom setting. All right, it's called admin tools. Looks very similar to a custom object. Matter of fact, they're basically derived from custom objects. I could create a new field. Again, looks just like a custom object. And as you see here, I have one field called unrestricted. And I can go in here, click Manage, and we'll see, as I said before, there's 3 levels in the hierarchy. There's the org level, and then there's the profile level and the user level. Right now, this is only set at the org level. So what I'm abstracted from is when I say, get me the value for this running user, Apex realizes that there is no value at the user level or the profile level and simply goes up there. But what if we were just to simply go in here and on the profile, flip this off? Now, all of a sudden, my code has flipped. So it's a nice little switch that I use where I've simply locked down this application because that custom setting now says for that running user that they don't have access. Of course, I could go in here, and while that location is at the profile, I could set it again at the user, and I could flip it on again. Go back here, refresh, and we're back. So hopefully that, one second. The point of this demo is to just kind of show the simplicity of custom settings and the power of it as well. And the fact that all of that is cached. Think of all of that metadata that you're querying every single time you're serving up a page or performing an operation. Don't leave that in the database. Try to use custom settings and leverage that efficiency. Okay, so we've talked about Batch Apex. We've talked about custom settings. Last but not least is the Apex scheduler. Now, using that use case statement again, since we don't have a scheduler today, and again it's in pilot, so I can't say today we have it, there isn't any really good way to schedule the execution of Apex code, and a lot of you already know that in here. One option is to use time-based workflow, not a great option. The other option is to use some sort of external service, external cron service, where you could use the SOAP API or email services or some other creative way to schedule some Apex execution. With the Apex scheduler, what we basically allow you to do is schedule Apex from our platform. And there's two types of scheduling mechanisms. There's one which is just basically a UI for admins. It's a simple UI that allows them to go in there and schedule Apex classes that have implemented the schedulable interface, and I'll show you how to do this. And then we also have API access. So if any of you out there have used cron, it's the same cron syntax that you can use programmatically to go ahead and create a complex schedule. And you can create up to 10 active complex schedules within an organization. And this is for the pilot right now. Those numbers may change, but that's kind of what we're doing with the pilot. So let's take a look. And again, if anyone is interested in being part of this pilot that isn't already, anyone part of the pilot in this room? Okay, a couple of people. Awesome. We have about 60, 70 customers right now that are in the pilot. If you have any interest whatsoever, find me, tap me on the shoulder, and I'll see what we can do to get you into it. Very excited about this and would love feedback from even more people. So I'm going to go back to the org here. All right, so I have a pretty basic Apex class, just need to find it, called Schedule Me. It implements schedule, and as such, we have one method called execute. Now, it's not actually doing anything, but let's say we wanted to schedule that search and replace batch function or class that I created. Well, we could simply just go, I just have to remember, search and create a, and bear with me, I think it's just the query, so select assistant name from contact, and then the field name, which is assistant name, and then the value, we'll just say Joe. And then let's not execute batch, and we're going to pass in this instance. So now when this is scheduled, this is just going to call this. And as you see here, I've just created a very simple query. Am I trying to scroll there? Select assistant name from contact, no filter criteria. So any contact, I'm going to go ahead and change that assistant name to Joe. Very compelling, I know. Okay. Save that. Now we're back in the list. You'll see this new button called Schedule Apex. So with Schedule Apex, here's that admin screen that I was talking about. Call the job name. We'll call it UI schedule. And the class. And we filter, so we'll only pull back those classes that are allowed to be scheduled, meaning those classes that implement the scheduler, or schedulable. And we'll do weekly, we'll do today, tomorrow, preferred start time. Now you'll notice we only allow you to do it by hour through this. We're deciding whether or not we want to go to a higher frequency, but at this point in time, this is where it is. Say we'll do it at 6 o'clock. We can all come back at 6 o'clock and see this run. Up. That implements the schedule interface. I've not seen this. That's not good. Let's try this one more time, shall we? Go back to the Apex classes. What if something happened here? Let's just... Okay. UI schedule. Okay. No one saw that earlier. Well, I don't know what happened. Nothing to see here. Okay, so let's take a look. All right, so this is scheduled 3 p.m. December 1st. But let's do the cron. Let me just see. Oh, great. Seriously? Hold on. I haven't used Firefox in a while. Allow my pop-ups, please. Okay, system log. All right, so let's do that cron schedule that I just talked to you about. Let's see if we can do this. Okay, I want to do, what is it? So an ID, cron ID, this is going to pass it back. System, schedule, and we'll call it Apex, or this is real. Cron expression, someone help me here a second. Minute, so what is it right now? 4:12, so we'll say 4:15, so that's 15. The hour would be 16. We'll just say every day, every month, optional 2009. Yeah. And then new schedule me 2. Okay. Success. All right, but let's just check because last time wasn't so successful. Okay, so this one is real. So at 4:12 today, no, at 4:15 today, this should run, and we'll take a look and see if this actually ran and changed those names. I have a little email set on that as well. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. But this is just showing you, again, a very simple way to schedule Apex. You can either use the UI to do it, or you can use the programmatic interface. Keep doing that. All right, but what's next? What's kind of the new exciting things? What is my team working on? Okay, so what are we working on? Well, obviously the first is scalability, but the other items that we're working on is monitoring and debugging, first and foremost. So right now what we're doing is we're building an event framework that the Visualforce team, the Apex team, the workflow team, and others can all leverage to give you a consistent log from an execution. So what that basically means is you guys are going to get a nicely formatted log that shows you the entry points and exit points of all the workflow actions, of all the Visualforce actions and Apex actions. Yes. So that was the clap I was looking for earlier. So we're doing that. We're very excited about it. The next thing that we're going to do on top of that is then provide the filtering. So the filtering, you guys have seen it in System Log, and who's been confused by the filtering in System Log? Okay, yeah. It's a little confusing, and that was Rich, who's the #1 developer doing this, who was laughing as well. But yeah, that is kind of a confusing topic at this point. So what we're doing is we're giving you a legitimate filter tool that will allow you to basically filter on the events that you're interested in from a system log perspective as well as from a debug log perspective. So when you're performing the debug logs and you're doing some monitoring and you want to persist that, instead of just getting everything in those logs, we now are going to give you a filter that allows you to specify exactly what you want. And then once we have the events and once we have the filter, then we're going to have the profiling. And the profiling is huge, right? Because everyone wants to know, if I've got an application, show me the hotspots. Where's the point where I'm performing a query too many times? Or where's the point in time where I've performed a number of DML statements on the same entity? Why am I doing that? Or why do I have so many method invocations of the same method in one request? What we're trying to do is, once we have that filtering, also provide you profiling tools as well that will help you be a little bit more efficient and effective from a development standpoint. Then, once we have the filtering, once we have the profiling, and we have this event framework, the next big thing built on all of this is going to be the debugger. So the debugger is the big thing for us that we're working on behind the scenes. And the idea today is that we're going to be able to surface all of these events, and we're going to be able to replay that execution, allowing you to kind of step through that execution. Instead of today where it runs in a process, you're like, I don't know what happened, go back, look at the logs. we're going to have a debugger. That is absolutely what we're putting out. Thank you. The next one that we're looking at is the Enhanced Test Framework. Now, we always talk to you about the benefits of testing, and I still absolutely believe in the benefits of testing. But sometimes it's hard to test on our platform, and I'll be the first one to admit that. I empathize with you guys as well. And what we're trying to do is get you the best possible tools to allow you to test your applications. And one of the first things we want to do is we want to silo tests from application data. Once you silo tests from application data, they become very, very portable. And instead of having the cases or issues where an application works in one environment but doesn't in another, and you can't figure out why these tests are failing, and lo and behold, it's because it's data dependent. This data was in one org, the data wasn't in the other org. Well, once we silo it, those issues are no longer going to exist. And the only time that your tests are really going to fail is when you've got some org shape, whether it's a validation or some sort of org shape like multi-currency that isn't enabled on your org, and that's a legitimate failure, right? You need to know about some new validation rule that may break some of your logic. So some keys there. We want to make them portable. We want to silo tests. And most importantly, provide you the setup tools that allow you to construct all of the data and all of the possible use cases that you want to test within your test. So instead of having these limits where you can only create 500 records or whatever it is, we want to get rid of that. We want to give you guys a very powerful foundation to test pretty much any scenario, to give you that 100% confidence when you deploy your application to your customers, or you as a developer are deploying a new feature to your organization's production environment. And then last but not least, simplify the limits. Now, the limits are not going away. Don't throw anything at me. They're not, it's just one of the realities in our service. But what we're trying to do is simplify them. Right now we have an eye chart, right? Everyone will admit we have an eye chart, where depending on the request, the action or the event, you have this set of limits. Now, some of us have basically memorized it. For others, it can be somewhat confusing and convoluted. So what we want to do is simplify the limits and really just put limits on the resources that we're trying to protect. Put limits on the database. Put limits on the CPU. Put limits on the heap. Try to get rid of the concept of, well, if it's invoked from a trigger context, it's this. If it's from a Visualforce controller or a web service, it's this. We want to try to get rid of that and just simplify the limits. And what we think that's going to do is give you a significant amount of flexibility from a synchronous perspective, synchronous transaction perspective, as well as we're looking at how do we flex these limits even more in the asynchronous world. So we've had a lot of comments. We're listening to those comments. My team is absolutely focused on these three key areas for the next couple of releases. We feel like we've delivered some great features for you, and now we're kind of heads down on making sure that you guys have the utilities that you need to be successful developers, programmers on our platform. And with that, we have next steps. So next steps, this video and everything else is online. And that second one, don't go home without a workbook and a set of developer cheat sheets. Has anyone seen the cheat sheets? They're awesome. I think they're awesome. If you guys don't have them, go get them. Before you leave this conference, go grab some of those cheat sheets. You can find them in the dev zone over there. They basically give you all of the methods from an Apex perspective, everything that you need to know in a couple of sheets, everything that you need to know for Visualforce, everything that you know from a declarative side. They're all there. It's fantastic. Next but not least, if you don't have an account, sign up for an account, freeforce.com. Don't ask for a credit card or anything like that. We want you guys to get excited. We make it as easy as possible to sign up for it. Feedback. Feedback is always welcome, whether it's negative or positive. Please let us know. We have some feedback forms. You guys can fill those out. And then obviously, I'll be around. Any questions that you have that I can help you with, let me know. Or any ideas that you have. I'd love to hear them. And that is it. So Q&A. So thank you. And there's going to be a lot of questions, I know. There's 2 microphones. And then if anyone's close up here, I think you just raised your hand. And what I'll try to do is I'll point at you, and I'll try to respond. So first we'll go in 3rd row. Left field. Yeah. So the question is, what is the Chatter API? I don't know. I don't think that should matter from... What I think we have or will expose are a bunch of libraries, and you can still leverage Apex to perform callouts if you need to. But I would need to check on that, to be honest with you. But very good question. Apologies, I don't have that answer. Yeah, if you want to get behind, the microphone there, and then I'll just try to do in the red.
So Visualforce, how does it find out how the asynchronous batch is doing?
Oh.
You didn't show that.
It's basically, 1 second here. So I use an action puller, and in that action puller, right now I'm just looking for any jobs that I ran today. But, well, I'll just show it. And I should have this up. I apologize, I don't have it today, but I will get it up there. So here I have a page block table, and you'll see here I'm just passing in async jobs. Let me just go find this controller, job status controller. And in the controller here, I'm getting the async jobs. What I'm basically doing is I'm just querying the async Apex job table. And what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing, you'll see here the create date today. Now, what I could also do is grab that ID that was generated when I called the batch job in the previous page, and then simply use that as the filter in the query. And then pull back those fields, and then I simply use those fields to play around with a div to create that quote-unquote animation of the percent complete. And then the action puller, because it's asynchronous, good point. Because it's asynchronous, I don't really have a handle to it, but I do have that ID of the job. So I use action puller, I just keep querying every 5 seconds to see where I am within that job itself.
Does that count against your API calls then?
It does, but they're each another request, right? When the puller runs, that's a separate request. So it's just one call. It's not anything to be concerned about unless in that puller logic you were doing something that wasn't very performant.
All right, thanks.
Yep, no problem. Yes? Yeah, you can abort a batch job. And basically what that will do is if you're in the middle of an execute, it will finish that execute, but no other executes will fire, and the job just basically gets killed. Yes?
You talked about simplifying testing, and I'm just curious, what's the likelihood, or is there anything in that to allow us to include our test cases in with triggers? Because one of the big challenges I run into, including test cases and triggers.
Sorry, I'm having a little... Can you guys turn up the... You want to put tests in your triggers?
Well, because when I put a trigger in my environment, if I didn't add it in the class already, then the trigger fails when I try to upload it. And
right.
if I put the test case in, I can't put any asserts in because the trigger's not in. I run into a race condition consistently, and so I'm not able to get full coverage with my test cases. So, I mean, I guess I get around that by making a class and calling the class, but I mean, just from a simplification standpoint,
yeah,
it's easier
I don't
for me to turn
understand
off
what
one
race
trigger.
condition you're running into. I'd have to, if you want to wait around, I can talk to you about that. But we haven't done that, and there isn't any reason I can think of why we haven't. It's just, from methodology standpoint, we had our test classes that, yeah, classes can incorporate, but we never really applied that to triggers.
Because if I want to disable a trigger, now I have to also make sure I'm updating my classes, and it makes
right.
it a management nightmare.
Right. That's a fair point.
Thank you.
Yes. Submit a batch in a batch? Recursion? No. Right. Right. So right now we're talking about if you can have multiple queries in one start context with a batch class, and the answer to that is no today. We could look at it, but right now the way that we see it is the batch class or the scope is just this kind of like one autonomous unit that then generates all of these executes. We were thinking about allowing people to hook batch onto batch, but that may be something that we do in the future. But right now, we're kind of limiting that only because of the size of operations that you guys can generate. With the scheduler, though, there's nothing stopping you from scheduling a number of batch jobs all at the same time or in some sort of sequence as well. But that's a valid question. One more feature. Okay. Yes. So the question was, or feature request was to have callouts from batch. Well, we do have callouts from batch, but we're only allowing you one callout per execute. In async, you can call 10 callouts, but in batch, it's one. And honestly, we just put that throttle in there because we weren't sure what the adoption was going to be, and we keep fighting internally to push that back to 10. Now, if that becomes a concern, let's say you have you're calling out to a service that you can only pass in, let's say, 10 records. Well, what you can do is with the scope for the execute, instead of keeping it at the default of 200, to set that at 10. But we are looking at seeing if we can flex a little bit more within those executes. But thank you. Good question. Yes?
Hi. Two questions, one quickie and then one real. The first quickie is, will all this code be available on the DevForce site?
Yes, my hands keep on getting slapped because I always forget to do that. But yeah, I'll do that. Which one are you interested in? Just all of it, or?
Mainly the Visualforce and how you work with the batch scheduling and all that.
Okay. Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay. And
to be honest, though, it may be next week. Is that? But yes, it will be there.
Okay. And you were talking about the improvements on test classes. Two of the problems we're having on test classes is, not even test classes, but executing the Apex itself, is when we're calling asynchronous services, if it happens to make a change to a record that we were already on, it winds up firing the triggers again, which automatically fires the sockles again, and now we've hit the sockle limit. And the other problem we have is we can't test web service callouts.
Yeah.
We have to fake the web service callout, which isn't really a test.
No, those are two bruises that I have. We are working on that.
Great.
There is no. I mean, I'll be the honest guy here. Those are issues that we need to fix. In that testing framework, one of the things that I want to do is make sure that we give the appropriate limits to the async requests that are invoked in a test context, so then you wouldn't run into those limits. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, allowing you to... The problem with callouts is, from our test context, the other system doesn't know that it's a test request. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to figure out how best to do that. We're working on it. But yes, you are absolutely right that is a hole in our testing framework that we are looking to, in the next couple of releases, to fix.
Great. Thank you.
But thank you.
Okay, I have a query that in execute, can we fire more queries? If yes, how many? Is there any limit on it?
I'm sorry, can I ask that question again?
In the batch Apex, we have one main query which will return, say, thousands of results. Now in execute, for each record, I want to fire a query. Whether I can do that.
So in the execute simply just inherits the async limits.
Okay.
So I think in the async limits, you can perform 100 queries.
100 queries, right.
I think, yes.
So for each batch, it will be 100 query limit.
Within each execute, you absolutely can, because they're all kind of considered different requests.
Okay. And if I want to cancel that request at some stage, can I do that from execute method?
In the UI, you can do that.
From the execute?
I don't think we have. I'll have to check. I don't think we have a method that we expose for you to kill it. You could logically kill it, but...
So if there is any exception, that batch will fail.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So again, using autonomous a little loosely here, each execute is considered kind of its own request.
Separate.
So if that fails, that's not going to impact any of the other ones. So what I would recommend if I'm building a batch process, and I'm concerned because there are going to be cases where one of those items may fail, to make sure that you can catch that failure and then persist that information into an auditing table or an email or whatever it may be, so you can go back at a later point.
Right, but in some case, like we have to like kind of stop the process right there. So it will be a feature request, I will say, like
Okay.
feature request where you should be able to cancel.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to abort it, then none of the following jobs would run.
Exactly.
But if you,
So obviously there is a way like you can put a static variable and then say just don't process anything else, maybe.
yeah,
do that,
there's some things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
But yeah, if you have any other questions, I'll be up here. Oh, we're at break. Can I, like 2 seconds?
Yeah, actually a couple of quick questions on scheduler. One is basically, can we batch stuff within a scheduler, which means we say execute this and then execute this within one schedule?
Well, within the execute, you can do whatever you want. So just think of that as a request.
But if I want to invoke two different methods, and if I want to say only when this completes, execute this, within the same batch, basically.
Yeah, you can do that within scheduler.
And can I specify who I want to run it as when I'm setting
No,
up the
but
scheduler?
we're working on that. That's a very good question.
Okay. Thank you.
And then I was told I gotta stop, but I'll take your question up here. Everyone, again, thank you for coming. I'll be around. Thank you.